Hey everyone. So a lot of people on TikTok, where I do my little mostly wargaming stuff, but also some archaeology, have asked me questions about what I used to do and things like that. And since TikTok is basically a 15 to a 60-second platform, it's really hard to sort of go in depth on anything, really, any topic. So what I thought I'd do is I've had this channel for a long time. I've just never really put anything on it. So let's give it a shot. See if anybody actually wants to interact with my content and go forward. So a little bit about me. My name's Tim Preston. You can look me up on the net. You can probably find some of my publications. Uh, I do a lot of things, but in this context, I was a senior archaeologist on a project in Belize for over a decade. And during that time, I worked on many excavations in and around the Maya city of Blue Creek, Belize. Now, if you want to find that, I'll have maps here in a second, but if you want to find where Blue Creek is, look up Blue Creek, Orange Walk District, Belize. It's a little Mennonite community on the border, sort of sandwiched between Guatemala to the west and Mexico to the right. Actually, we would go across the Mexican border lots of times to do things like pick up American cigarettes and Mexican beer and tequila because, well, one, it was a Mennonite community and Mennonite communities are dry, and two, because, well, Belizean cigarettes really suck, and Belizean beer isn't that good either. So I thought I'd start this off by giving sort of an oversight, sort of an overall, not an oversight, a sort of just talk about the site of Blue Creek where I spent a majority of my time. I also did some work in Mexico. I did some work in Peru and just minimal work in Peru, and led a tour through Guatemala and Mexico and stuff like that. So I've been around the area for a while. So sort of let's get to it and let's see if I can get this to work. So here we go. The site of Blue Creek, like I said, Blue Creek is a probably medium-sized Maya city in the country of Belize. Oops, let me get over here. There we go. Here we go. So if you aren't used to Central America, let's take a look at it. Of course, you know, U.S. up there. Mexico, and then down here, this is the heartland of the Maya. So you had sort of the Yucatan area of Mexico, of course, the entire country of Belize, most of Guatemala, and down into Honduras, and a little bit in El Salvador. A little closer up, we're looking at the Yucatan and Belize here. And what we have is all these sites are some of the larger Maya sites that you have probably heard of. Chichen Itza, let's see, Washington, Tikal, of course. If you know Belize, you've probably heard of Chichen Itza, maybe Lamanai. If you've been to Belize, you've I'm sure have gone out to Ambergris Cay, which is out here. Oops, you can't see I guess if I pointed, I would have to point that way. Getting used to stuff here. Cozumel's up here. So now if you look down, the site of Blue Creek is right here, where the star is. The border between Mexico and Belize is actually the Rio Hondo there. And then, of course, Washington and all this is in Guatemala. All right, so moving forward, I'm trying to see things. I obviously need to look to see where I put my camera better. Anyway, this is a close-up of the area of Belize where I worked in. So here's the Rio Hondo once again. It's the border between Mexico and Belize. And here's the site of Blue Creek. And so I worked throughout this area. It's called the Eastern Petén Zone. It's bordered by an escarpment, so it's a karstic limestone geology. Lamanai is down here, where we would go to the Lamanai Lodge for not when we needed to go to a bar, honestly. Site of La Milpa is in Belize and all. Here you have the border. So our area was basically this all up here. Now, there's some things that are mislabeled. I also started excavations at Ishnoha, which is not in Mexico. It's actually in Belize. And Gray Fox is in Belize, not in Mexico. We purchased the jungle around Gray Fox to preserve it at one point. So this is sort of the area. So here we are, Blue Creek. Zooming in a little bit more, here you have all these little dots are defined Maya structures, households, everything from small house mounds, which would be what we call residences for the non-elites, to large ritual buildings. So here's the site core of Blue Creek. It's down here, and I'll give a close-up map of that. Here is what we call the Western group. The Western group was an area of large elite residences. Most of these were non-elite sort of commoner residences. We call them house mounds. The area down here was where you had agricultural fields, and you had mostly non-elite residences with a few public buildings and shrines. And I did my first work up here in the site of Rosita, and that's where I did my master's thesis. And I'll show some slides of that. And as I do further presentations, further videos, I'll talk more about the various sites where I worked. Okay, so here are some of the groups that we look at. So once again, here was the site core, and that was where you had the large ceremonial buildings and where the leaders of and the king of Blue Creek would have lived. Quintan, these were high elite residences. They were around from at least the late pre-classic through to the late classic. These were abandoned around 800 AD. I'm not really associated with the project there anymore, which is the Maya Research Project, and so I haven't really kept up on some of the latest archaeology. So I don't know if the dates have been tuned in a little closer. Once again, here you have Chan Kahal, which was an agricultural area, Saklum, residential area. Down here, the Rempel Group. The Rempel Group is interesting. I led excavations there, and I found what I thought was a really neat burial there, which I'll talk about at some point later. The Rempel Group actually held on into the post-classic, or at least we had people visiting the Rempel Group in the post-classic. I don't actually think that any construction went on there, but there was a large central, we'd probably call it a temple or a shrine, where offerings were left in the post-classic. Ushalil Bay was some small commoner households. Looks like they were people that came in late, around the late classic, and was part of a migration, so like a large number of people coming in. Where I spent several years and where I did my master's thesis was up here in the Rosita group. Now the Rosita group comprised a series of elite compounds or courtyards that was centered around a water source and agricultural fields. And interestingly, part of my research was thinking about the Maya being more of a dispersed rather than a hierarchical. I sometimes can't speak. Hierarchical society. They were more of a heterarchical society in that you had power groups distributed around the central core. And what I found during my excavations that actually while the core down here and Quintan, or the Western group, were the elites associated with the core work, it was basically abandoned around 800 AD. Rosita was still going strong 80 to 100 years later, as was another excavation that I worked on, that I led down in this area. That was another elite compound. So we're looking at here, the site core is right around here. We're at the top of about a 300-foot escarpment. Chankahal and the agricultural fields, we had vast agricultural fields down here. The site core was here. Rosita group is up in this area. Sort of an overview of what the geology looks like. So like I said, core area, the western group's right there. Rosita was up here. Chankahal is down in this area. Here we have a look at the core of, well, the site core. Structure 9 was a very large and important shrine. Actually, a ritual on it was featured in National Geographic. At the time, it was I believe, the third largest jade cache ever found in Mesoamerica. This was before I worked at the Blue Creek site. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. We did have a ball court. That, along with some bas-relief images, showed that Blue Creek actually had a king and was an independent polity. So you had several large structures on various platforms. You had elite residences, which was structure 19, shrines. And these were all raised up on large platforms. So here we have a picture of the excavation of the exterior of structure 9. Now, if you know anything about my archaeology, you know that their buildings were sort of worked like onions, where you'd start off maybe in earlier times with a more modest building, and instead of demolishing that building and building something grander like we would do in modern days, what they did is they simply bury the earlier phase of the structure and build around it so it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. It's sort of like layers of an onion. And here you have the exterior of the onion, that is how structure 9 looked in the late Classic. Here we have a reconstruction of structure 9 at an earlier time. You notice that it had a sort of a perishable structure on the top, a big central staircase going up a typical Maya pyramid. Whoops, hey, I was wrong. The cache was in structure 4, not structure 9. It's been a while since I've looked at these slides. Anyway, this is a picture that came from National Geographic. And what you have here is just massive amounts of jade being lowered into a cut at the top of the pyramid. This is a shaft that went down. And this is sort of like taking all the disposable income of a community, gathering it up all in one place and shoving it down a hole and sealing it up so nobody can use it again. Here you look at, this is structure 4. So it had a non-perishable superstructure. And in front of the superstructure, you had this shaft that was cut. The jade was put at the bottom, and at the top, it was sealed with a banner stone, an engraved banner stone. This would have been where we call it a banner stone because it's a disc with a hole in the center, sort of like this. You have a disc with a hole in the center, and that would be used. You put a post in there. You put a post into the hole. It would go up, and they would hang a banner from it. Now, there were 4 caches put around the circumference of the top of the cache, and in those they were we found prenatal remains of 4 infants. Actually, we don't know if they were prenatal or immediately postnatal. We don't know, but they were infant burials. And there was also a portion of a stela. And on the front down here was where we had masks of the King of Blue Creek. We call it a Howe mask. Moving on to the western group, and this was a series of elite residences that were along the top of this sort of raised area. There were bajo, very fertile areas that sort of flooded around the bottom, and those were agricultural areas. Here you have various courtyards, and you can see these were large family groupings or extended family groupings for elites. A lot of them incorporated central shrines or ancestral shrines as well. Here you have an example of the structure 37 Boswellia. This grouping was extensively excavated by Colleen Hanratty. I believe she would, well, I hope she is Dr. Hanratty by this time. She was on the verge of getting her PhD when I stopped my association with the Maya Research Program. I wish her all the best because she is a wonderful archaeologist. In the structure 37 Boswellia, she found multiple ancestral burials. These would have been important people to the lineage. Here you have, sorry, I should have done, warning, human remains. Here you have some bones, part of the burial, and some large vessels. Changa Hall, this was at the bottom of the escarpment. This was, like I said, an agricultural area where you had a whole bunch of these small house mounds that would have been for non-elite households. Now, U5 was interesting. U5 was a shrine, and it was a central shrine. And when it was excavated, if you take a look down here, we called it the crazy paving. We had no idea what that was for, and we did not really understand it at the time. We knew that this was a shrine. It was probably also a central processing place where people would corporately process the crops that were grown around it. During my excavations at Rosita, I found a similar structure, and this was only one of the 3 or 4 structures at that time that had been found in Belize, and it connected the cultures out to the coast. Unfortunately, this structure was completely destroyed, so I was never able to go back and re-excavate it to look into it in more depth. And I'll talk more about the crazy pavey in other presentations, other videos. So here we're looking out at some of the agricultural areas of Changa Hall, and you notice, if you see these lines all throughout here, well, what these are ditches that are used in conjunction with raised fields. Now, these ditches weren't really used for irrigation. What they were used for is to drain the water away from the fields, so that what the crops that were grown in these sort of raised beds were irrigated by the rain, not by groundwater, because the groundwater had very high levels of calcium and could actually kill plants. So what the Maya did is they dug ditches to drain the groundwater away, funnel it into ditches that eventually led to Rio Hondo. Part of the focus of the Maya Research Program in the later years while I was there is looking at the extent of these ditched fields throughout Belize and Mexico, and we were able to find them basically within a kilometer of any river. Definitely within a kilometer of the Rio Hondo, we found ditches all along this area. And what this was the remnants of really intensive agricultural production. And that was needed because the Maya had a very large population in the Classic period and through the late Classic. Now, let's move up a little bit and talk just minorly about the Rosita Community, and this is where I spent several years excavating, both for my master's thesis and afterwards. So my master's thesis really concentrated on this group, Group C. This was an early map. It actually doesn't look like this after I ended up excavating it. And it had, here you had several structures, Structure 8, Structure 9, and then here we had Group B that was up in this location and several other groups that were scattered around. Now, these maps came from a pre-excavation survey. That's why it looks different than how it ended up being. Here's a panorama of the Rosita area. Now, surprisingly, thinking about Belize and jungles and all, you would have thought that during the Maya times, this all would have been covered by jungle and all. But actually, it wasn't. The Maya pretty much cut down all the trees around their settlements. And actually, for kilometers out from the settlements. They needed the wood in order to make plaster, and they needed a lot of wood. So we know that by the early Classic, and definitely into the late Classic, there's very little jungle in the areas around Belize. When you look at pollen samples, it was mostly grasses, a lot of corn, very little tree pollen. So these structures are concentrated on the tops of these rises, where the low areas are down here would have been taken up with agriculture. We call them bajos for low. Here's Group C again, close-up of it. Here's the courtyard, the Group C courtyard, where I spent a lot of time excavating. Structure 9 is down there. We'll talk about that later. Structure 8, Structure 10. But here's a picture of it. This is Structures 5 and 6. So you had Structure 5 here, this raised area. This is an ancestral shrine. And then Structure 6 is this whole raised area going out here. And this turned out to be a residence comprised of 3 rooms. Structure 7. These pictures were all taken prior to me doing excavations. This was the preliminary scouting of the area, where I was basically picking where I was going to be doing my research. Up the top there with a little bit of scale, that is Dr. Thomas Gooderjohn, who is the director of the project. We have another structure. You get very good at seeing these unnatural sort of humps on the landscape if you do archaeology for any length of time in the Belizean area. These areas have all been cleared for cattle and other types of agriculture, although I did spend a lot of time in the jungle as well. And Structure 9 there. It's actually not a ritual administrative structure. It was a household. Now this is Group B. Group B ended up looking nothing like the map we have up there, and I spent a year excavating that one as well. And that's about it. Sort of an overview of the Blue Creek area and the sort of a setting for some of the things I'll be talking about when I'm talking about my work. Guess that's about it. So let's. So what I'm planning for this channel is there'll be a bunch, it'll sort of be a scattershot thing, and I'm hoping that I'll get input from people to give me a better idea about how you want it to go. It's going to be split between sort of more serious anthropology, archaeology stuff, and probably some Warhammer and 3D printing content as well. If I see that it's really going one way or another, then I'll simply, switch focus. But that's pretty much it for now, and I hope to see you later. You can see me here at Life Unusual on Instagram. I'm at A Life Unusual, and on TikTok I'm at Life Unusual, and I'll put all of those in the show notes. Pretty much it. See y'all later. Bye now.